Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to our exploration of Muhammad Ali Amir-Moezzi's groundbreaking work, Divine Guide. In our last episode, we covered the preface, where we saw how this book challenges conventional understanding of early Shia Islam. Today, we are diving into the introduction of Chapter 1, titled Return to the Earliest Sources. And let me tell you, this section is absolutely crucial for understanding everything that follows. Before we begin, I want to share with you this epigraph which Amir-Moezzi placed at the beginning of this chapter. It's a hadith from Al-Kafi, and it immediately signals that we are entering into deep theological waters. Qala Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, inna haditha ala Muhammadin sabun mustas'abun la yuminu bihi illa malakun muqarrabun aw nabiyyun mursalun aw abdun imtahana Allahu qalbahu lil iman. The Messenger of Allah said the hadith of the Ali Muhammad is difficult and becomes more difficult. None believe in it except an angel of proximity or a prophet sent to men or a servant whose heart has been tested by Allah for iman. Now the phrase sabun mustasabun in this hadith uses two related words from the same root, and this is common Arabic rhetorical technique to strengthen the meaning beyond what a single word could convey. Another translation of this phrase could be difficult and extremely challenging, or arduous, and formidably difficult. And the repetitive nature of the phrase serves to emphasize just how challenging the matter is, suggesting it's not merely difficult but requires extraordinary faith and effort to believe and act on it. And it's important to note here that it's not that the hadith are difficult to comprehend or understand, but rather the difficulty lies in believing in them and accepting them. And this hadith isn't just poetic language, it's a warning and an invitation. We are about to explore ideas so profound and frankly so radical that they've been largely overlooked or misunderstood for centuries. So what exactly is Moezzi trying to accomplish here? He is making a bold claim that we have fundamentally misunderstood early Imami Shi'ism. The entire structure of Imamism, he argues, is built around one central figure, the Imam, as the divine guide. But here's the surprising twist. While everyone acknowledges the Imam's importance, we have lost sight of the why and the how of this importance. Now here's where Moezzi's approach becomes kind of revolutionary. Instead of relying on later theological developments or comparative analysis with Sunni Islam, he's going straight to the source. The actual words attributed to the Imams themselves, the Hadith and the Akhbar, dating from the middle of the 7th century to the beginning of the 9th century. This is like bypassing centuries of theological commentary and interpretation to hear what the founding figures actually said about themselves and their role. But Moezzi is honest about the challenges he faces. This corpus of early Imami literature is impressively vast, abstract, lacking homogeneity, and requiring systematic examination. It's a scholar's nightmare and dream rolled into one. But here's what's really fascinating. The very complexity and quote-unquote heretical nature or the heretical character of these ideas is precisely why no one has attempted a comprehensive study like this before. Scholars have shied away because these early Imami concepts are so radical, so different from mainstream Islamic thought that they've been either ignored or explained away. What Moezzi is doing is essentially, think of it like archaeological work, digging through layers of later interpretation to uncover the original theological landscape of early Shia Islam. And what he is finding challenges everything we thought we knew. So now here comes one of the most important arguments in the entire book. While the current widespread scholarly consensus characterizes the Shia religion, the Imamism, as essentially a rational theology, similar to the Mu'tazilite theology, which was the Islamic theological school renowned for prioritizing reason and logical argumentation, the Mu'tazili school. But Moezzi fundamentally challenges this interpretation. And this radical departure is based on two observations. First, the Imams constantly spoke about aql, which is usually translated as reason. The Imams spoke about aql as the key to understanding their doctrine. And second, Imami Shi'ism did indeed develop a strong rationalist current early in its history, which still exists today. But here's where Moezzi delivers his stunning revelation. What if we've been translating and understanding aql, the notion of aql, the concept of aql, the meaning of aql, completely wrong? Think about this for a moment. What if aql in early Imami usage didn't mean rational thought in the Aristotelian sense, but something entirely different? What if aql has no independent role in deriving law and legal rulings using rational analysis and systematic logical reasoning? What if it referred instead to a kind of spiritual faculty, an inner organ of perception that allowed believers to grasp divine truths, truths that defy rationality? This would completely change our understanding of early Imamism. Instead of a rational philosophical system, we'd be looking at something much more mystical, much more esoteric. This leads Moezzi to one of his most crucial insights. There aren't just different periods in Imami history, there are actually two fundamentally different Imami traditions, each with its own worldview, each with its own understanding of what it means to be a Shia. The first tradition, and the original one, is mystical esoteric, focused on the Imam as a cosmic figure with divine knowledge and supernatural abilities. The second tradition, which has become more dominant, is the rationalized, systematized, and much more in line with mainstream Islamic theology. Moezzi argues that the rationalized version didn't replace the original tradition immediately. Rather, it appeared, if not quite late, at least after the time of the Imams. And this is a crucial chronological point because it means that during the actual lifetime of the historical Imams, the tradition was primarily mystical and esoteric in character. Now you might be wondering, how can Moezzi possibly distinguish between these two different traditions? How can he tell which sources reflect the original teaching and which reflect later rationalization? And this is where his methodology becomes really sophisticated. Traditional Islamic scholarship relies heavily on isnad, the chain of transmission, to authenticate hadith. But Moezzi points out that the science of Imamite hadith criticism developed quite late, well after the period that he's been studying. So the criticism came much later than the period that we are focusing on. So instead of relying on the traditional authentication methods, Moezzi proposes using doctrinal history as his guide. If you can trace how ideas evolved over time and you can work backwards to identify which sources preserve the earliest forms of the tradition. And this methodology is groundbreaking because instead of asking, is this hadith authentic according to traditional criteria of, isnad analysis, Moezzi is asking, does this hadith reflect the theological worldview that we can historically locate and trace to the earliest period of Imamism? So Moezzi organizes his entire methodological approach around 4 key elements. And I want to make sure we understand each one because they're going to shape everything that follows in the book. First, understanding aql in its original meaning. So as we discussed, this isn't about aql as defined in our traditions. It's not about rational thought in the philosophical sense, but it's about a specific faculty for perceiving divine truth. Second, distinguishing between the two Imami traditions that we just talked about, the original mystical tradition versus the later rationalized tradition, each with a completely different worldview. Third, identifying authentic early sources, using doctrinal history rather than the traditional hadith criticism to determine which texts actually preserve the earliest teachings. And fourth, understanding the authority and nature of Imamite hadith, how these sayings function in the early Imami, like the early Shia communities, and what kind of authority they carried. Moezzi calls these epistemological elements because they're the conceptual tools we need to understand everything else in the book. And without grasping these 4 points, we can't properly evaluate the radical claims about early Imamism that Moezzi is about to present. Let me step back and help you appreciate just how revolutionary this approach is. Traditional scholarship has assumed that Imami Shiaism developed in a relatively straightforward way from early political disputes about succession after the Prophet Muhammad into a sophisticated theological system. But Moezzi is arguing that we've got this backwards. The early tradition wasn't a primitive version of later systematic theology. It was something qualitatively different, something that later systematic theology actually obscured and replaced. And here's an analogy to understand this. Think of this like discovering that what we thought was a simple folk song was actually a fragment of a complex opera. The later tradition didn't just systemize the early tradition, it actually fundamentally changed its character. And this has implications that go far beyond academic Islamic studies. If Moezzi is right, then one of the major branches of Islam has been significantly misunderstood for centuries. And we're not just talking about scholarly corrections here. We're talking about recovering a lost spiritual tradition. In this introduction, Moezzi has laid out his methodology and his central thesis, but he's also done something else. He's prepared us for ideas that are going to challenge our assumptions about Islamic thought, about religious authority, and about the nature of spiritual knowledge. Remember that opening epigraph about the teaching being so difficult that only prophets, angels, or specially tested believers can endure it? The hadith that we quoted earlier? Moezzi isn't being dramatic. He's warning us through this hadith that we're about to encounter concepts that mainstream Islamic thought has either forgotten or actively suppressed. In our next episode, we'll dive deeper into chapter 1 as Moezzi begins to unpack these 4 methodological pillars in detail. And we'll still be on chapter 1 for a few more episodes, and we'll explore what aql really meant in early Imami usage. And trust me, it's going to challenge everything we think we know about reason and spirituality in Islamic thought. So until then, I encourage you to sit with these ideas, think about the implications of there being these 2 fundamentally different Shia traditions or points of view, and consider what it means that the mystical, esoteric elements might be the original core, not later additions. This is just the beginning of our journey into the Divine Guide. And I promise you it's going to be a fascinating ride. So thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next episode as we continue our deep dive into Amir-Moezzi's groundbreaking work. Ma salam.